You were always on.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hollywood Remembers video. Today, we're going to pay a heartfelt tribute to the American stars we've recently lost, as well as other beloved figures around the world who have touched our lives. Before we begin, if this content resonates with you, please leave a like. It helps the channel continue bringing you tributes made with respect and care. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. Nigel McCrery was an English writer, producer, and storyteller who helped shape modern British crime television. He was 71 years old. Born in London on October 30, 1953, Nigel passed away on February 6, 2025, in Nottingham. For millions of viewers, his name may not have always been on screen, but his work was part of their weekly lives. He was the creator of Silent Witness, a series that ran for decades and changed how forensic science was portrayed on television. Later, he brought a very different kind of energy with new tricks, blending cold cases, humor, and aging detectives who still had something to prove. Both shows endured because they felt human. The crimes mattered, but so did the people investigating them. Before television fame, Nigel's path wasn't a straight line. He worked in different fields, including policing, and that real-world experience quietly informed his writing. He understood procedure, yes, but more importantly, he understood character. Fatigue, doubt, persistence, the small moments between the big ones. Colleagues often spoke of him as thoughtful and generous with ideas, someone who listened, someone who cared about the craft, not just the credits. His stories respected the audience. They didn't rush. They let silence speak. Nigel McCrery leaves behind a body of work that continues to play in living rooms around the world. Familiar theme music, familiar faces, and a reminder that good storytelling doesn't shout. It stays. Kenoly was an American singer, songwriter, and worship leader whose voice helped shape modern Christian praise music. He was 81 years old. Born on December 6, 1944, in Coffeyville, Kansas, Ron passed away on February 3, 2026. For decades, his music filled churches, arenas, and living rooms around the world. He wasn't just performing songs, he was leading moments. Moments where people lifted their voices together, sometimes quietly, sometimes with everything they had. His work became a cornerstone of contemporary worship, especially during a time when congregational praise was being renewed and reimagined. Ron rose to global prominence in the 1990s, recording live worship albums that traveled far beyond the walls where they were captured. Songs like Ancient of Days and Lift Him Up weren't built for the radio. They were built for the church. Simple, scriptural, strong, and they worked because people could sing them together. As a worship leader, Ron Kenoly carried both authority and warmth. There was joy in his voice, but also reverence. He believed worship was not about the spotlight. It was about pointing people upward and bringing them together, no matter where they came from. Those who knew him often describe a man of deep faith and steady humility. Someone who understood that music could open hearts, but only if it was offered honestly. Ron Kenoly leaves behind melodies that are still being sung, week after week, across the world. His legacy lives in shared voices, raised hands, and the quiet certainty that worship, when done with sincerity, can unite millions. Virginia Hallis McCaskey was a quiet but powerful figure in American sports. She was 102 years old. Born on January 5, 1923 in Chicago, she passed away on February 6, 2025 in Des Plaines, Illinois. For more than 4 decades, she was the principal owner of the Chicago Bears, one of the most historic franchises in the National Football League. She assumed ownership in 1983, following the death of her father, George Halas, a man known as one of the founders of the NFL itself. It was a legacy handed down, but it was never taken lightly. Virginia did not seek the spotlight. She wasn't a sideline presence or a loud voice in meetings. Instead, she led with steadiness, tradition, and loyalty. To her, the Bears were more than a business. They were family, history, responsibility. She believed deeply in honoring what came before while protecting the future of the team. Players, coaches, and staff often described her as gracious and deeply principled, someone who remembered names, someone who asked about families. Faith and humility guided much of her life, and that tone shaped the organization in ways that don't always show up in standings or headlines. Her tenure saw both triumphs and struggles, but her commitment never wavered. Through changing eras of football, ownership, and culture, Virginia Halas McCaskey remained a constant. She leaves behind one of the longest ownership legacies in professional sports, and for Bears fans, her presence will always be felt in the history, in the values, and in the team she protected for more than 40 years.
Willie Nelson is more than a country music legend. He is a living story about endurance, identity, and becoming comfortable with who you really are. Long before the braids, the weathered voice, and the outlaw image, there was a restless boy learning how music could soften the sharp edges of life. This is not a story about fame. It is a story about persistence, shaped by loss, instinct, and quiet reinvention. This story is not about hit songs or sold-out tours. It is about becoming. About a man who kept adjusting his shape without ever abandoning his core. Willie's journey shows how survival sometimes looks like stubbornness, and how creativity can become a form of self-defense when the world feels unpredictable. Willie Hugh Nelson was born into instability. Raised by his grandparents in Texas, he grew up between contrasting forces. His grandparents offered structure, discipline, and responsibility. Love was present, but it was firm, practical, and earned. Emotional expression was subtle, not spoken aloud. At the same time, music floated freely through his world, offering something softer, warmer, and forgiving. These opposing forces shaped him early. Authority on one side, emotional refuge on the other. Willie learned how to navigate silence by filling it with melody. Where words felt limited, music felt infinite. He wasn't rebelling. He was adapting, finding balance between expectations and inner need. Music quickly became more than talent. It became protection. Willie realized that a guitar could open doors, calm tension, and give him a place to stand when everything else felt uncertain. Singing was not about applause. It was about grounding himself. Rhythm gave him control. Lyrics gave him language. As a young man, Willie chased opportunity with urgency, radio jobs, songwriting sessions, constant movement. His early ascent came through writing rather than performing. Songs flowed easily, almost too easily, and others found success with his words. That success arrived fast, but it did not bring stability. The growth was rapid, recognition followed, money came and went. The structure, however, was missing. There was no long-term plan, only momentum. Willie was learning the business while moving inside it, often one step behind. What looked like progress was fragile underneath. When the cracks appeared, they did so quietly. Poor financial choices, relentless touring, and industry pressure left him stretched thin. There was no scandal, no dramatic collapse, just the slow realization that success without alignment is exhausting. The system was working, but it wasn't working for him. The next chapter of his life did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as redirection. Nashville had expectations, and Willie didn't quite fit them. His phrasing was different, his voice was rougher, his songs didn't always follow the rules. So he stepped away from chasing approval and began listening inward. This shift changed everything. Willie stopped trying to become what the industry wanted and started becoming what felt honest. That decision did not bring immediate rewards. It brought clarity. Identity replaced ambition. Belonging replaced validation. What followed was not instant triumph, but momentum with meaning. Willy's artistry deepened. His writing grew more personal. His performances became intimate rather than polished. Without fully realizing it, he was building the foundation for something lasting. The real transformation was not musical. It was internal. Willy learned that survival sometimes means slowing down. That freedom is not escape, but alignment. The early years shaped him not into a star, but into a survivor with a voice uniquely his own. This was only the beginning. Willie Nelson learned early that talent alone does not protect you from exhaustion. After years of chasing momentum, he reached a point where forward motion no longer felt like progress. The industry still saw potential, audiences still listened, but internally, something was misaligned. This chapter of his life was less visible, yet it was where his identity quietly began to harden and clarify. This part of the story is not about rebellion, it is about adjustment. Willy was not trying to burn bridges, he was trying to breathe. By the late 1960s, Nashville had rules, not written ones but cultural ones. Songs had to fit formats, voices had to sound clean. Artists were expected to polish the rough edges away. Willy, however, was built from rough edges. His phrasing lagged behind the beat. His voice carried wear instead of shine. His lyrics felt lived in, not produced. At first, he tried to adapt. He played the game. He recorded albums that followed expectations. None of them truly reflected who he was. The disconnect was subtle but corrosive. Each compromise made him more visible and less himself. The success was respectable, but it felt borrowed. What made this period difficult was not failure, it was partial success. Enough recognition to keep going, but not enough authenticity to feel settled. Willy was becoming known without feeling known. Financial pressure added weight. Touring never stopped, writing never slowed. Yet the rewards never seemed to solidify. The faster he moved, the less grounded he felt. This wasn't collapse, it was erosion. Instead of fighting the tension directly, Willy did something instinctive. He stepped sideways. He returned to Texas, not as a retreat but as recalibration. Away from Nashville's expectations, he allowed his instincts to resurface without apology. Texas gave him space. Space to sound different, space to be informal, space to let songs stretch and breathe. The audiences there didn't demand polish. They wanted truth. That difference mattered more than charts. This was the moment Willy began to bend without breaking. Rather than forcing himself into rigid systems, he adjusted around them. He stopped asking how to fit in and started asking what felt sustainable. Musically, his songs grew looser. Structurally, they broke rules. Emotionally, they leaned into ambiguity rather than resolution. Life, he understood, was not tidy. Why should music pretend otherwise? This shift did not bring immediate validation from the industry. In fact, it distanced him further from mainstream approval. But something else happened. He began to attract people who understood exactly what he was doing, even if they couldn't explain it. Listeners who valued honesty over refinement found him. Identity replaced ambition as the main driver. Willy stopped chasing relevance and started building coherence. He wasn't trying to be louder, he was trying to be truer. What makes this period important is not what he achieved, but what he refused to abandon. He kept his phrasing, he kept his voice, he kept his perspective. These choices limited some opportunities but preserved his center. This is often where stories skip ahead, but this quiet recalibration is the core of Willy's longevity. Many artists burn out because they scale success faster than self-understanding. Willy slowed down just enough to realign the two. He didn't announce a reinvention. There was no manifesto. Just small, consistent decisions made in favor of honesty. Over time, those decisions accumulated into something unmistakable. By choosing sustainability over approval, Willy created room for something bigger than immediate success. He didn't know what was coming next. He only knew that pretending no longer worked, and that decision changed everything. Willie Nelson did not become an outlaw by declaration. He became one by accumulation. Small choices, made consistently, began to separate him from the center of the industry. Not loudly, not angrily, quietly and permanently. This chapter is about permission, Not the kind granted by institutions, but the kind a person gives to himself. By the early 1970s, Willie no longer asked whether his sound would be accepted. He asked whether it was honest. That question simplified everything. It removed negotiation. It removed self-editing. What remained was instinct. What people later called the outlaw movement was never a coordinated rebellion. It was the result of artists who stopped apologizing for being misaligned with the system. Willie didn't reject Nashville. Nashville simply stopped being the center of gravity for his decisions. The most important change was internal. Willie stopped measuring himself against external approval. He was no longer trying to prove range, discipline, or conformity. He trusted that coherence mattered more than control. This trust reshaped his music. Songs slowed down. Space entered the arrangements. Silence became part of the composition. His voice no longer rushed to resolve emotion. It lingered. Where earlier recordings aimed to impress, these performances aimed to reveal. Vulnerability replaced precision. Texture replaced polish. The music felt closer to conversation than performance. Audiences responded not with frenzy, but with recognition. Listeners didn't feel dazzled. They felt understood. That distinction matters. Fame excites. Recognition connects. Financially, the risks were real. Stepping outside the system meant fewer guarantees. But Willie's relationship with money had already been reshaped by instability. Security, he learned, comes less from structure than from self-trust. One of the quiet breakthroughs of this period was creative autonomy. Willie began recording music the way he heard it, not the way it was supposed to sound. That autonomy did not make him famous overnight. It made him durable. This durability is often mistaken for luck. It wasn't. It was the result of internal alignment. When identity and output match, friction disappears. Energy stops leaking. Another subtle shift happened during this time. Willie stopped explaining himself. Early in his career, he had tried to justify his style, his phrasing, his choices. Now he let the work speak. Explanation became unnecessary once confidence settled in. This confidence wasn't bravado, it was calm. Calm is harder to shake. His songwriting deepened as well. Themes expanded beyond romance and heartbreak. Mortality, impermanence, freedom, regret. Not as statements, but as observations. Willie did not moralize. He noticed. That observational quality would later define his greatest work. He wasn't preaching freedom. He was living inside it. He wasn't celebrating imperfection. He was accepting it. The industry eventually followed, not because it understood, but because it couldn't ignore what was happening. When enough people respond to authenticity, systems adapt, not out of enlightenment, but necessity. This is an important distinction. Willie didn't win because the industry became wiser. He won because the audience found meaning in what felt real. By the end of this chapter, Willie had something far more valuable than momentum. He had clarity. He knew who he was making music for. He knew what he would not compromise. He knew that longevity is built on self-acceptance, not domination. This is where many artists stop growing. They find identity and protect it rigidly. Willie did something different. He treated identity as a foundation, not a prison. That openness would soon allow him to evolve again, not away from himself, but deeper into himself. And that evolution would carry him into the most visible, influential phase of his life. Willie Nelson had already done the hardest work by the time widespread recognition arrived. He had aligned his sound with his identity. What came next looked like a breakthrough, but in truth, it was convergence. The world was finally meeting the artist he had already become. This chapter is not about sudden discovery, it is about delayed understanding. When Red-Headed Stranger entered the picture, it didn't behave like a typical commercial album. It was sparse, quiet, almost defiant in its restraint. No grand production, no obvious singles engineered for radio dominance. Just a narrative, unfolding patiently, trusting the listener to stay. That trust was the risk. Industry executives were skeptical. Minimalism read as absence. Silence read as weakness. But Willie understood something the system didn't. Emotional weight doesn't need volume, it needs coherence. The album's success surprised everyone except the person who made it. Audiences didn't just listen, They leaned in. The stripped-down sound invited participation. Listeners filled the empty spaces with their own memories, regrets, and hopes. The music didn't perform emotion. It created room for it. This is when Willy's presence shifted from admired to essential. He wasn't dominating airwaves through force. He was reshaping expectations through confidence. What made this phase different was not just acclaim. It was authority. Willy no longer represented an alternative. He became a reference point. Younger artists didn't see him as an outlier. They saw him as permission. Permission to sound imperfect. Permission to age honestly. Permission to slow down. The outlaw label followed, but it was always secondary. Willy wasn't rejecting society. He was rejecting pretense. That distinction mattered, especially to an audience growing tired of polish without substance. His visibility expanded rapidly after that point. Collaborations increased, tours grew larger, media attention intensified. Yet his internal rhythm remained unchanged. He did not speed up to match attention. He let attention adapt to him. This consistency protected him. Where sudden fame often fractures identity, Willy's identity had already hardened gently over time. There was nothing to chase, nothing to prove. Another important shift happened here. Willy's relationship with vulnerability became public. Not dramatic vulnerability, not confession, but openness. He allowed sadness, humor, resignation, and warmth to coexist in the same breath. That emotional range widened his audience beyond genre. People who didn't listen to country music listened to Willy. Not because he crossed over strategically, but because emotion is not genre-specific. Financially, success became more stable. But money was no longer the metric guiding his decisions. It became a resource, not a destination. This mental reframing kept his creative instincts intact. What's often overlooked about this period is discipline. The looseness of his sound hid precision. Knowing when to leave space requires control. Restraint is not the absence of effort. It is mastery. Willy mastered understatement. As the decade moved forward, he became something rare in popular culture, a figure who felt timeless while remaining present, not trapped in nostalgia, not obsessed with reinvention, simply consistent. This balance allowed him to collaborate across generations. He didn't compete with younger artists. He complemented them. His presence added depth rather than contrast. What the audience sensed, even if unconsciously, was integrity. Willy was not performing a version of himself. He was repeating himself honestly, which is far more difficult. This chapter represents the moment where personal alignment translated into cultural impact, not through dominance, but through resonance. The path that once felt isolating now looked inevitable in hindsight, but inevitability only exists after courage does its work quietly. Willy didn't arrive, he stayed. Willie Nelson reached a stage of life that quietly ends many careers. Time passes, voices change, trends move on. For most artists, this is where presence fades into memory. For Willy, it became something else entirely. This chapter is not about resisting age, it is about refusing to disappear. As years went on, Willy's voice grew thinner, more fragile, more exposed. Technically, it lost power. Emotionally, it gained weight. Instead of hiding the change, he allowed it to be heard. Where others tried to recreate their past, Willy documented his present. That choice reshaped how audiences related to him. He wasn't asking listeners to remember who he was. He was inviting them to walk with him as he changed. Aging became part of the art rather than a threat to it. Culturally, this mattered more than charts. In a world obsessed with youth, Willy modeled something rare: continuity. He didn't reposition himself as a legacy act. He stayed active, curious and visible without pretending time hadn't touched him. This visibility was subtle. No grand reinventions, no desperate relevance grabs. He collaborated when it made sense. He released music when it felt honest. He toured not to prove stamina, but because performing still felt like home. The industry often treats age as a liability. Willy treated it as texture. Lyrically, his songs leaned deeper into reflection. Not nostalgia, but awareness. Themes of impermanence, forgiveness, acceptance. He wasn't summarizing his life. He was still living it, one observation at a time. What made this phase powerful was restraint. Willie understood that volume does not equal impact. He didn't crowd the cultural space. He occupied it calmly. That calm became its own kind of authority. Audiences didn't feel fatigued by his presence. They felt reassured. In a landscape of constant turnover, Willie represented continuity without stagnation. He was familiar without being repetitive. This is where his legacy quietly solidified, not through milestones or awards, but through reliability. People trusted him to show up as himself. That trust is harder to earn than attention. Another important element of this chapter is humility. Willie never positioned himself as an elder statesman above criticism or learning. He remained open, curious, available. That openness prevented him from hardening into a symbol instead of a person. He aged in public without explanation. There were moments of vulnerability that everyone recognized without being spelled out. Health scares, losses, slowing pace. None were dramatized, none were hidden. They simply existed alongside the music. This approach deepened his connection with older listeners and quietly invited younger ones. Not because he chased them, but because authenticity translates across generations. Young audiences may not share his references, but they recognize sincerity when they hear it. Financial success and recognition continued, but neither defined his choices. By this stage, Willie had fully decoupled worth from output. He created because creating kept him aligned. This distinction explains his longevity more than any genre label ever could. Most artists are remembered for what they did at their peak. Willie is remembered for staying present beyond it. He didn't freeze himself in time. He moved forward gently, allowing erosion and depth to coexist. Aging, in his case, was not decline. It was refinement. He became a reminder that relevance does not require reinvention. It requires honesty sustained long enough for people to trust it. This chapter closes not with resolution, but with continuity. Willie did not wrap up his story. He kept adding quieter lines to it, lines that didn't demand applause, only attention, and that may be his most radical achievement.